Welcome back to the Lane Report. In this presentation, we discuss the role of the organic state theory in the development of historical and modern foreign policy by imperialist countries. One of the most infamous geopolitical theories developed out of Germany at the end of the 19th century. Between 1897 and 1901, geographer Friedrich Ratzel published a series of essays on the nature of the state and its relationship to man. Of these essays, Lebensraum, Politesha Geographie, and Volkerkunde would form the broad political theory known today as the organic state theory. At the time of publication, Ratzel was working as a lecturer at Leipzig University, where he taught several prominent students that would later create the environmental determinist philosophy within the field of geography. He is considered today as the progenitor of social Darwinism, and National Socialist philosophy developed 2 decades after his death. According to Ratzel's theory, the state is a living organism that must eat, drink, and grow in order to survive. In his first analysis on the nature of man and space, titled Volkerkunde, Ratzel organized people into groups called Volkers, which primarily consisted of cultural units similar to nationalities. He argued that most Volkers were mixed race and largely based on common political and cultural values. He argued that individuals that make up Volker worked together like cells in a complex organism. In order for the Volker to survive, it needs space to grow, otherwise it will die. He later introduced an idea called Lebensraum in an essay titled Lebensraum, a Biogeographical Study, where he argued that all creatures require and compete for living space to survive. Because space is finite, there will be a constant conflict between species over control of living space, or Lebensraum. Organisms not only compete for living space, but they also fight for control of resources. In this essay, he argued that groups of organisms need to migrate to new territory to grow, but also need to colonize those areas. Here he states, quote, "A single plant or animal may travel along such paths a people, a race, a species can only migrate by colonizing." In other words, groups of organisms, or in the case of people, Volkers, need to colonize and conquer territory in order to survive and thrive. Ratzel would combine his various theories on the nature of society in his book titled Politesha Geographie. Here, he applied Darwin's theory of evolution to the development of the state. He argued that culture and the modern state were naturally evolutionary adaptations to the natural environment. Because Volkers act as a complex organism through an evolutionary process, and organisms need Lebensraum to survive, it only made sense to Ratzel that the state itself was a complex organism that needed to expand. Ultimately, Ratzel believed that the natural evolution of society from small tribal communities to the contemporary centralized state was necessary for the survival of the species. Central autocratic state control was a result of the subservience of the population as a whole. He made this perfectly clear in his book titled The History of Mankind when he said, quote, "Arbitrary rule has its basis not in the strength of the state or chief, but in the moral weakness of the individual, who submits almost without resistance to the domineering power. The submissive nature of the population at large gave autocratic rule rationale." It's comments like this that provide context for Ratzel's philosophical foundations. Much of his arguments were based on the writings of earlier philosophers such as Machiavelli, Friedrich Hegel, and John Stuart Mill. To Machiavelli, the survival of the species was dependent on the stabilization of state power. In The Prince, Machiavelli states, quote, "It is much safer to be feared than loved, because love is preserved by the link of obligation which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment which never fails." He argued that a good ruler must control the population by creating a constant state of fear of retribution. In Machiavelli's opinion, the development of central control was a natural process in the evolution from primitive to advanced society. In order to retain control, and therefore keep the peace, a ruler should keep people divided amongst themselves and institute punitive measures for dissident voices. This philosophy was an integral part of the organic state theory. Under this paradigm, the role of the state was simple: To keep the organism healthy, the state must eliminate any threat to the health of the organism. G.W. Friedrich Hegel was another philosopher that significantly impacted Ratzel's theory. In 1817, Hegel published an extensive book on the principles of logical progression titled Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, in which he outlined his philosophy known today as the Hegelian dialectic. According to Hegel, logic follows a series of steps by which an argument is given, an opposing argument is given in response, and both arguments are synthesized into a logical conclusion of truth. He also applied the dialectic to issues regarding authority. The thesis, an event on a large scale, is followed by the antithesis, or the reaction. The combination of the thesis and the antithesis results in a synthesis, or a solution to the initial problem. Of course, the solution is not always positive. For example, the French Revolution started in 1789 as a result of the excesses of King Louis XVI. This initial action was the thesis. The reaction of a disillusioned middle class resulted in the creation of the terror government of Maximilien Robespierre. The reign of terror represents the antithesis. The synthesis is represented by the establishment of the French Empire under Napoleon Bonaparte. When applied to the organic state theory, the Hegelian dialectic is especially useful at coercing the public into accepting authoritarianism for the health of the organism. For example, in 1930, following the stock market crash, the National Socialist Party of Germany won significant political control, but was still lacking a majority of support. Hitler joined forces with leaders from the bourgeois Conservative Party to keep the communists from taking power. However, the Communist Party still had significant support. In order to seize control of the German government, Hitler ordered Nazi Party members to infiltrate the police force and military. On February 27th, pedestrians near the Reichstag building heard the sound of breaking glass. Flames erupted from the building, causing approximately $1 million in damage. Hitler immediately spread the news that the fire was started by communists attempting to destroy the seat of government. The following day, Paul von Hindenburg, the president at the time, abolished freedom of speech, assembly, privacy in the press, legalized phone tapping and interception of correspondence, and suspended the autonomy of federated states. The Reichstag fire ultimately resulted in a rise to power of the Nazi Party and the suspension of civil liberties in Germany. This is a prime example of the Hegelian dialectic. The Reichstag fire represents the thesis, the first step in a series of actions. The reactionary president removing civil liberties represents the antithesis, or the reaction, and the ultimate rise of Hitler as the leader of Germany is the synthesis. Ratzel's organic state theory not only borrowed ideas from the teachings of Hegel, it synthesized some of the philosophical undertones of John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. According to Mill, each action should be judged on the result from the whole, as opposed to the morality of a single action. For an action to be ethical, it should produce pleasure for the majority. The ethical philosophy of utilitarianism differed from Immanuel Kant's philosophy of deontology, which argued that each action should be judged alone based on ideas of a universal good and evil. Mill opposed this philosophy and argued there is no such thing as universal good and evil. When applied to the state, policies should not be judged on an individual basis, but should be judged based on the outcome. If policy negatively impacts a small minority, but the large majority benefits, then the action was ethical. This philosophy is based primarily on the philosophy of consequentialism, or the ends justify the means. When applied to the organic state theory, utilitarianism can prove useful to those in power. Because the state is a living organism, any individual who opposes the state should be treated like a virus to the body politic. By removing or extinguishing the virus, the state can remain a healthy organism. Actions to remove the individual are then viewed as ethical because the state survives and prospers. It would be the culmination of Ratzel's organic state theory, the Hegelian dialectic, and Mill's utilitarianism that would ultimately give rise to the philosophical beliefs of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Of course, the organic state theory did not die with the end of World War II. Throughout the final months of the war and for several months after, the United States Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, developed a rat line out of Germany through the Vatican and into the United States, termed Project Paperclip and Operation Gladio, hundreds of Nazis were smuggled out of Germany during and after the war and transported to the United States and Argentina to continue their research. They took their philosophies with them. Several prominent criminals, such as Emil Augsburg and Reinhard Gehlen, joined the CIA after immigrating to the United States. Well versed in the philosophy behind the organic state theory, the ideas of these individuals permeated throughout the U.S. government. Today, while not stated publicly, the military and intelligence apparatus apply the organic state theory to U.S. foreign policy. One prominent example is the recent bombings of Syria in response to chemical attacks from President Bashar al-Assad. In 2013, both France and the UK reported that a chemical attack on the city of Ghouta had been perpetrated by the Assad government. Evidence was largely based on unconfirmed witness testimony and soil samples provided to the UN by witnesses. At the time, Assad refused to allow UN investigators on the scene. The Syrian government denied the attacks and blamed it on al-Nusra-controlled rebel groups. The rebels blamed it on Assad. Under Russian and U.S. suggestion, Assad agreed to join the Chemical Weapons Convention and allow all its stockpiles to be destroyed. Another alleged chemical attack occurred in 2017 near the town of Khan Sheikhoun. The U.S. government responded with 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles before any investigation had occurred. Both the Russian and Syrian governments denied a chemical attack occurred and claimed the attack was staged. A report by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or the OPCW, concluded that sarin gas, or a complex nerve agent like sarin, was dropped on the town. They claimed the attack could only have been carried out by the Syrian government due to the reported airplanes and bombs that were used. These conclusions were made based on eyewitness testimony and soil samples taken by witnesses. A study published in 2020 in the Global Journal of Forensic Science and Medicine modeled the attack and concluded that the attack was not performed from aerial bombers, as reported by the OPCW, but more likely accomplished using an improvised rocket-propelled artillery round. According to the paper, the, quote, crater that the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, found to be created by an air-dropped chemical weapon was instead created by an improvised short-range artillery rocket armed with a small explosive warhead. It went on to say that, quote, the OPCW incorrectly identified this crater as the source of a chemical release by an air-dropped bomb. The crater is instead from the impact and explosion of a short-range improvised artillery rocket. Their findings also indicated that, quote, the crater contained no observable evidence of a sarin container. The most recent reported attack occurred on April 7, 2018, in Douma, Syria. According to reports from Western news corporations, 2 chemical bombs were dropped on the city of Douma by the Syrian Air Force. The U.S. military responded with airstrikes against key Syrian targets. News reports on the Douma attack were televised across the world and on social media. A group known as the Syrian Civil Defense, or White Helmets, arrived on the scene after the alleged attack and recorded the now famous video where they pulled children from debris to clean the chlorine gas off of their skin. The White Helmets received international recognition from this video, but later reports called into question the origins and intentions of this group.
Tonight, the argument presented to us by our government about the reason we're in Syria has come into question with a report about a bloody attack that may have killed 1,600 civilians. 1,600 civilians. 2 independent agencies, Air Wars and Amnesty International, are now confirming the nature of an attack led by the U.S. coalition. And this is not pretty. Now, the reason the report seems highly credible is due to the fact that they interviewed as many as 400 witnesses who came forward and were willing to be interviewed and described what is starting to look like a massacre. This happened back in 2017, never properly reported by the West. In fact, the Pentagon has continued to this day to downplay the damage from their attack, saying that maybe somewhere between 160 and 200 people may have been killed. This report arrives as new questions are being raised now about the infamous White Helmet Brigade in Syria that have been billed as heroic and neutral rescue workers. And the question, of course, begs, are they? Here to separate fact from fiction is our crack correspondent, Michelle Greenstein, who's been working on this story for us. What are you finding out? We've got two stories here, really. The incident, which is really jaw-dropping, and the fact that we're now learning some things about this the white helmet group, right?
Right. So the big picture, I think, is that while we love to say this is a humanitarian intervention, that the U.S. is involved because it wants to protect civilians, the real goal is, of course, to overthrow the government of Syria. And in doing so, they will partner with outfits like the White Helmets with terrorist ties and also let civilians die along the way. And it's actually notable that Amnesty, of all organizations, is even coming forward to say this because in the past they've gone along with regime change propaganda.
Yeah, and 400 witnesses is a lot of people.
Exactly, and they launched a huge investigation. So they have a stake to bear here. The fiction when it comes to the White Helmets is that these are impartial rescue workers, that they are heroes who just remove children from rubble. This fiction is seen in the Netflix documentary that won them an Oscar. This is a group heralded by the State Department and is a huge source for Western corporate media reports about Syria. In fact, they were one of the first sources to blame the Syrian government for the chemical attacks. But guess what? At least 40 former White Helmets members actually admit to staging chemical attacks in Syria. Now, there have been questions about the White Helmets before, their links to terrorist organizations like al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, the allegations of them doctoring footage, using children as props, and being involved in the summary executions of civilians. There's, of course, the allegations that they were funded by a UK military officer, so not just founded by the West, but also continues to be funded by the West, where the U.S. Agency for International Development has given them at least $32 million. But today, a group called the Foundation for the Study of Democracy confirmed some of these suspicions in one of their press conferences just this morning. They interviewed over 40 former White Helmets employees, as well as the residents from the areas that the White Helmets used to operate. Some of these employees said that they saw the White Helmets stage attacks with their very own eyes. So these are not volunteers. These are not rescue workers, right? These are employees with monthly pay, and they also received aid. And a lot of the times that included food. So a lot of these members say that they only joined because it was the only way for them to avoid starvation for their families. And a lot of former employees also say that those who did work for free, those who were volunteers, left after they were forced to take part in some of these staged incidents like shootings. So this is not a group of volunteers, right? In fact, one victim said that he was thrown in jail for refusing to work with the White Helmets. The commanders would often threaten to kill those who refused to execute these tasks. And the one employee actually I think is really interesting. He went on a mission to rescue some civilians, including his father, and he was threatened when he came back by his commander with physical punishment for going without orders.
The most important question in all of this to me, or to anybody looking at this from the outside, would be impartiality.
Right.
Because if they are impartial, they can make mistakes. But what you seem to be saying in your report is that that impartiality argument is not holding
Right,
water.
and all you have to do is look at their funding. Not only is it over $30 million from the U.S. government, we also have money from the UK Foreign Office and other entities like the government of Qatar, who would love to see the Syrian government fall. Today, RT actually asked the director for the Foundation for the Study of Democracy what he think will happen, because now all this information is out there. What does that mean for the White Helmets? So let's take a listen.
Okay.
You know, I think what will happen is what usually happens. The first step is when Western countries and the Western media try to ignore this information, but we probably have already passed that step. Now, we found that the representatives of the Western countries try by one method or another to resist this information and make statements about how they don't consider the White Helmets to be an organization connected to terrorists, and it's not true. And what is interesting is that they don't present any arguments. They, as a rule, use formulas that no, there are no doubts that this is a humanitarian organization that is not connected with terrorists.
Humanitarian organization or organization with ties to the West who's basically trying to get rid of the Assad regime?
I mean, the best mask that you could put on like a military outfit is that of humanitarian aid. That's something that no one wants to argue against, right? What are you, anti-humanitarianism? So it's a very interesting strategy.
That's a good report. Thank you so much,
Thank
Michelle.
you.
Well done. Good digging.
After reports of the chemical attack on Duma circulated the media, the OPCW performed a full on-the-ground investigation. Initial reports were inconclusive on the nature of the attack, but the final report, released March 1st, 2019, concluded that there were reasonable grounds that chlorine was used as a chemical weapon in the attack. The report also suggested that chlorine was released by cylinders that had been dropped from the air, as indicated by their condition and surroundings. After the report was released to the public, internal documents were released from WikiLeaks indicating internal divisions between OPCW investigators. In one document, lead investigator Ian Henderson had concluded that the two cylinders were not dropped on location, but carried on the ground and manually placed on site. Another document indicated symptoms from individuals on the ground weren't correlated with exposure to chlorine gas. The third document was an email exchange requesting the removal of the 8 on-site inspectors from discussions on the investigation. Their analysis would eventually be removed from the final report. Henderson released his findings to the media, but few mainstream sources reported on it. With his information open to the public, other academics were able to evaluate the leaked information and compare differences between the original report and the final report submitted to the United Nations. After reviewing the leaked report, MIT Professor Emeritus Theodore Postel said, quote, "When you look at the original report, there is no doubt that the second report, the report sent to the Security Council, was not an accident. It was intentional. If you look at the diagrams and figures in this altered report, that actually in some cases contradict the findings. It appears to me that this was designed to intimidate non-specialists." Postel accused the US, French, and UK governments of undermining the professional integrity of the OPCW for the purpose of advancing certain strategic geopolitical outcomes.
And now there's an attempt on the part, I think, of the US government, the British government, and the French government to destroy the professional integrity of the OPCW. This is extremely serious.
Well, and we have some evidence of that because, as I mentioned earlier, Jonathan Steele, the veteran British journalist, former chief foreign correspondent for The Guardian, he spoke to one of the whistleblowers. I believe the whistleblower who was not Ian Henderson, the author of that leaked engineering report, somebody else who he identifies as Alex. And Alex, the pseudonym for the whistleblower, says that 3 U.S. officials showed up at the OPCW as all this internal debate was happening, as all of these experts were objecting to the exclusion of their findings on the ground in Duma. And Alex relays that 3 U.S. officials came in and told them that basically, no, the finding is that Bashar al-Assad's government committed this chemical weapons attack, and this has to be the OPCW's conclusion.
Well, the only reason that Americans could be at this thing would be if they chose to provide intelligence in support of their claim. Otherwise, they should have been bounced on their head out of the meeting, because it's the OPCW staff, assuming they're competent, and it appears like they are very competent, who have to debate the issues and understand the technical detail. The Americans represent the American government, not the UN as an independent source of judgments that are related to international law. The UN is responsible for maintaining its independence as a source for judging whether international law was violated. And in fact, the Ambassador Arias, in my judgment, should be removed from the position he's in. The fact that he allowed this to occur, and in fact, I think it's been more than allow it to occur, it looks like he has been carrying water for the Americans, Brits, and the French on this. And he should be bounced out of the UN as far as I can see.
And it's striking, you mentioned earlier Jose Bustani, the first Director General of the OPCW. He is among those who have, and yourself included, who are calling for the OPCW to hear from these experts, the ones that they ignored. But Jose Bustani's call so far has not been heeded. I want to go back to the Henderson.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I want to underscore again, the Secretary General of the UN is responsible for this. People have to hold the Secretary General to account. If the Secretary General is not up to this, then they probably should find another Secretary General at the UN.
The information provided by the leaked documents received little attention from the mainstream media, and warnings by Professor Postel were largely ignored. After the release of documents to WikiLeaks, Ian Henderson was relieved of his duties at the OPCW and escorted off the premises. On January 20th, 2020, Henderson testified on his findings in front of the UN Security Council.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ian Henderson. I'm a former OPCW inspection team leader, having served for about about 12 years. I heard about this meeting and I was invited by the Minister Counselor of the Chinese mission to the UN. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances around my ESTA visa waiver status, I was not able to travel. I thus submitted a written statement to which I will now add a short introduction. I need to point out at the outset that I'm not a whistleblower. I don't like that term. I'm a former OPCW specialist who has concerns in an area, and I consider this a legitimate and appropriate forum to explain again these concerns. Secondly, I must point out that I hold the OPCW in the highest regard, as well as the professionalism of the staff members who work there. The organization is not broken, I must stress that. However, the concern I have does relate to some specific management practices in certain sensitive missions. The concern, of course, relates to the FFM investigation into the alleged chemical attack on the 7th of April in Douma in Syria. My concern, which is shared by a number of other inspectors, relates to the subsequent management lockdown and the practices in the later analysis and compilation of a final report. There were two teams deployed. One team, which I joined shortly after the start of field deployments, was to Douma in Syria. The other team deployed to country X. The main concern relates to the announcement in July 2018 of a new concept, the so-called FFM core team, which essentially resulted in the dismissal of all of the inspectors who'd been on the team deployed to locations in Douma and had been following up with their findings and analysis. The findings in the final FFM report were contradictory, were a complete turnaround with what the team had understood collectively during and after the Douma deployments, and by the time of release of the interim report in July 2018, our understanding was that we had serious misgivings that a chemical attack had occurred. What the final FFM report does not make clear, and thus does not reflect the views of the team members who deployed to Douma, in which case I really can only speak for myself at this stage. The report did not make clear what new findings, facts, information, data, or analysis in the fields of witness testimony, toxicology studies, chemical analysis, and engineering and/or ballistic studies had resulted in a complete turnaround in the situation from what was understood by the majority of the team and the entire Douma team in July 2018. In my case, I had followed up with a further 6 months of engineering and ballistic studies into the cylinders, the result of which had provided further support for the view that there had not been a chemical attack. This needs to be properly resolved, we believe, through the rigors of science and engineering.
The use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government was now being called into question. Evidence for chemical attacks on Ghouta, Khan Sheikhoun, and Douma had all met strong opposition from academics and researchers, but continued to be used as rationale for U.S. involvement in the region. If the attacks weren't performed in the manner they were being portrayed, then why was the United States supporting regime change in Syria? Back in 2006, WikiLeaks revealed documents indicating U.S. plans to overthrow the Syrian government by instigating a civil war. The U.S. partnered with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt to promote sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shiites. The document also included plans for Israel to expand its settlements into the Golan Heights in Syria. Black budget money was used by the CIA through groups like the National Endowment for Democracy to arm and train protesters in Syria during the so-called Arab Spring. The plan to overthrow Syria had nothing to do with chemical attacks, as the first alleged attack did not occur until 2012. Prior to the first bombing of Syria by the United States, plans were underway to build a natural gas pipeline from Qatar through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Syria, then into Turkey. Assad refused to sign the agreement and instead agreed to allow a Russian-planned pipeline to be built from Iran through Iraq and Syria, then to Lebanon, where gas would be shipped to Europe via the Mediterranean. Assad's refusal did not sit well with the U.S., and weapons were quickly sent to moderate rebels with ties to ISIS and al-Nusra. Chemical attacks and U.S.-funded terrorists were just the excuse the U.S. needed to overthrow the Assad regime. U.S. conflict with Syria is a prime example of the organic state theory in action. U.S. government strategists view the state as a living organism that needs resources in order to grow. In this case, the natural gas is part and parcel with the Lebensraum required for the state to remain healthy. In order to exploit the natural gas without directly taking over territory, the U.S. needed a subservient government in Syria. Because Assad refused to work with the U.S., actions were taken to get the U.S. public to support military action. Enter the Hegelian dialectic. Chemical attacks were used as the excuse to bomb Syria, but little direct evidence of Syrian government involvement ever surfaced. This represents the thesis, or the problem. The American public was devastated by the false reporting from the White Helmets, but most were unaware of the game being played. This is the antithesis, or the reaction. The synthesis is represented by the direct military action administered by the U.S. military between 2017 and 2019. Geopolitics is a field of study that has been used by political power brokers to ensure their continued dominance on the world stage. In particular, geopolitical theories from Halford Mackinder, Nicholas Spykman, Emanuel Wallerstein, Alfred Mahan, Samuel Huntington, and Friedrich Ratzel have had a profound effect on foreign policy over the past century. Commentators and academics often blame the subjugation of the developing world by the wealthy industrial class on a thirst for profit. This, however, is short-sighted and fails to consider the many examples of wasteful spending by the elite on time-consuming and expensive political interventions. The political and corporate elite have more money than they could spend in several lifetimes, so profit is the least of their worries. The true nature of global conflict is based on the need for power and control over the masses. Strategies perpetrated by the elite are based on a handful of geopolitical theories by an exclusive group of academics, theories that were integrated into the very fabric of Western governments and still impact the world today.
Have you heard the news that's going around here? The man in charge has got to go, 'cause he dances around the public, boy, and the problem is the man in charge, you know. Now the young